Morning to all of you. So, in this lecture, we are going to discuss the relationship between human rights and environment. So, this is a topic which comes in the module 4. This is the last topic which comes in module 4. So, we are going to see what is the relationship between human rights and environment. So, to begin with this topic, that is human rights and environment, we need to know what do you mean by human rights first of all. Since you have not learned the subject human rights, I'll be just giving you a brief introduction as to what you mean by human rights. Though it is not a subject which can be comprehended in a lecture like this, but I'll just try to explain to you the basic principle behind what we call it as human rights. So the basic definition of the term human rights is that human rights are those basic and minimal rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. So in simple sense, we can say that those rights which we consider to be very basic and the minimum rights which are there for every human beings without any discriminations whatsoever, we call it as human rights. And human rights are considered to be inalienable rights. What do you mean by inalienable? You can't alienate your rights. You cannot sell it to anyone else. It is inviolable rights. Nobody can take away your human rights. And human rights belongs to everyone, or rather it is given to no one, because it is something which is inherent in the very nature of human beings. And human rights are the rights which are held by every human being in relation to the government, state, and public authorities. So, if at all someone can take away your human rights, it is just the state who can take away your human rights. And human rights are considered to be limitations on the power of the state in relation to an individual. So if I say that I have a right which is my human right, that means the state is not allowed to intervene with that particular right, or state is not allowed to come into or take away that particular right which is given to an individual. And the idea of human rights is necessary to keep the government from becoming tyrannical or despotic. So, if individuals are not given any basic rights at all, that government will definitely lead to despotism. So, hence, we can say that human rights are those fundamental rights to which every human being, let it be man or woman, then a rich man or a poor man, then a normal human being or a disabled human being, whoever it is, and who is inhabiting in any part of the world. So, human rights is something which is common to everyone residing in the whole world. There is no distinction as to, yes, you have a set of human rights, but you don't have it. Okay. So, inhabiting in any part of the world should be deemed to be entitled merely by virtue of having been born as a human being. So just because you are born into this society as a human being, you are bestowed upon with certain basic rights which are fundamental for your existence in this society as a human beings. So those rights are being called as human rights, and you can see this particular set of rights which we call or refer to as human rights is common with regard to everyone at any point of time. So when you talk about human rights, you can see there are various classifications of rights which in general we call it as human rights. So a few classifications are like civil and political rights, socio-economic, cultural rights. So the basic of all these human rights is the right to life. So right to life is considered to be the most important among all these rights. And in order to realize this particular human right, especially the right to life, and even the other rights like right to health, right to livelihood, etc., a right to a healthy and clean environment is much needed. So whenever we are talking about right to life, and especially in relation to right to health, right to livelihood, etc., we should understand that in order to realize such a right, there should be a right to healthy and clean environment. That is why we say that both human rights and environment, right to environment, are a cluster of rights which are interrelated. So we can clearly say that a right to environment itself is a human right. So that we have already seen in the Indian perspective when we discussed Article 21 in detail, and its development with regard to the inclusion of a right to clean and healthy environment as a part of right to life. So there is no doubt right to environment itself is a human right. And damage to environment adversely affects the right to enjoy human rights at its fullest. So right to environment is actually a prerequisite in order to attain and enjoy your other human rights. And the link between these two, that is human rights and environment, it emphasizes that a decent physical environment is a precondition for living a life of dignity and worth. I told you in the very beginning itself, there are various classifications of human rights, and I'm not going into its details, but one important classification is important to understand in this context. That is, human rights has been classified into three, and right now not three, more than three, but the basic classification is three generations of human rights. So the first generation human rights are the fundamental civil and political rights. Example, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, etc. They are considered to be the first generation human rights. And you can also link it with the concept of liberty from a very broader perspective. I am talking right now. So, these first generation rights, which is generally civil and political rights, you can relate it with the concept of liberty. And these rights are considered to be individual safeguards against an oppressive governance structure. So, if you take from the constitutional perspective, these rights can be seen in Part 3 of the Constitution, where the fundamental rights are being explained and enumerated. Now, moving on to the second generation rights. Second generation rights are the so-called socio-economic rights, which are guaranteed to the individuals for their welfare. And examples are right to health, right to food, right to work, etc. And I'm not surprised that you might be understanding the link between part 3 and part 4 right now with regard to the generations of rights. So the second generation rights are those rights which you can see under part 4 of the Constitution, that is directive principles of the state policy. And the responsibility of ensuring these rights falls on the government. So it is the positive rights or positive obligation on the part of the government to ensure those rights which are mentioned in the second generation rights, or the so-called socio-economic rights. And the third generation human rights are the group rights or collective rights, or they are also known as solidarity rights. Say, for example, a right to peace, a right to development, etc., are examples of third generation human rights. And right to a healthy environment is also considered to be a very important third generational human rights. Now, coming to the interrelationship between human rights and environment, we can say that human rights and the environment are intertwined, and human rights cannot be enjoyed without a safe, clean, and healthy environment. And sustainable environmental governance cannot exist without the establishment of and respect for human rights. Environmental protection is thus a precondition to the enjoyment of internationally guaranteed human rights, especially the rights to life and health. And environment protection is thus an essential instrument in the efforts to secure the effective universal enjoyment of human rights. And human rights cannot be secured in a degraded or polluted environment. It's so clear that you cannot enjoy your human rights without having a basic or a clean and safe, healthy environment. Now, discussing the relationship between human rights and environment, there are three basic approaches which are generally taken. One is protection of the environment is a precondition to the enjoyment of human rights. that is what we have already discussed right now. So, in order to enjoy your human rights, there should be the environment should be protected, especially when we talk about the right to life, right to health, etc. It is very important. The second approach is that certain human rights are essential to achieve environmental protection. That is, whatever we have mentioned in the first approach, it's just the vice versa. So, in order to achieve environmental protection, certain human rights are essential. That is generally with regard to the protection of human health. Again, right to life and health is coming again and again whenever we take any of these three approaches. And the third one is right to a safe and healthy environment is an independent substantive human rights. So right to environment is independent from any other human rights. It is not needed that it should be always linked to right to life and health. So these are the three basic approaches which is generally taken when we discuss the relationship between human rights and environment. And one interesting factor you should notice, most formulations of right to environment qualify it by words such as healthy environment, safe environment, secure environment, clean environment, etc., making it clear that the link between environmental protection and human health. So, whatever we are talking about with regard to environment, that is always linked with the human health, which is essential in order to enjoy your right to life, which is the most basic of human rights. Now, let us see how these international human rights documents have considered the subject of right to environment, especially the most important human rights documents, say from 1948, the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then the two important international covenants, the ICCPR, which is International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966, then ICESCR, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, that too of the same year 1966. So how these three important documents and other international documents which pertains to the protection of human rights, how they treat and consider the right to environment as a human right. So, international human rights institutions has appreciated the intricate interlinkage between environment and human rights. So, you can see that there is always, though I've mentioned the three approaches, I always support the first approach. That is, in order to materialize or in order to realize your fundamental, basic fundamental human rights, you need to have a safe and clean, healthy environment. So when you analyze the international documents also, you can get the same feeling that international human rights is always linked to the international environment protection also. So various human rights were interpreted in the context of environment, especially right to life that we have already mentioned, which is the most fundamental of human life and which is the most noticeable right interpreted in the context of environment. And explicit provisions can be seen which is pertaining to the environment uh, in most of the international instruments. So one thing is sure, wherever you can see the right to life which is mentioned as an important human right, there automatically right to healthy and clean environment comes in. So the examples would be firstly UDHR, that is Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. It protects the right to life and it also speaks about a standard of living adequate for health and well-being. And it also speaks about a right to a healthy environment which can be inferred from these rights. And the right to life is again protected in the ICCPR, that is International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which automatically presupposes a right to healthy environment. Again, wherever you speak about the right to life, you can always link it with right to healthy environment. Now, moving on, the next important document is ICESCR, that is International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It accords protection to adequate standard of living and highest attainable standard of health under Article 12, Clause 2, Subclause B. So this is one of the earliest documents in which it categorically states that the protection should be given to adequate standard of living and highest attainable standard of health. So that can be obviously related to the right to clean and healthy environment. And various subsequent international documents has also been used to elaborate the environment human rights relation. And you can see the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee. They are interested with the duty of providing with general comments. So this committee has also addressed the right to a healthy environment, especially with regard to general comment number 14 on the highest attainable standard of health and health. The committee has established that the right to health embraces a wide range of socio-economic factors that promote conditions in which people can lead a healthy life and extends to the underlying determinants of health such as food, nutrition, housing, access to safe and potable water and adequate sanitation, safe and healthy working conditions, and a healthy environment. So all these factors are important when to look into when we discuss the right to a healthy environment. And right to healthy environment is essential when we talk about the right to life and especially right to an adequate standard of living. Now, apart from the international documents, there are certain regional documents on the protection of human rights at various regional levels. A few examples would be European Convention on Human Rights, then American Convention on Human Rights. But it is not worthy to mention African Charter on Human Rights. And in Article 24 of this charter, it explicitly addressed the right to a healthy environment. And it stresses that the right of peoples to live in a satisfactory environment which will promote their development. I've quoted this particular article in order to make you understand that, see, the rights of peoples are wholly dependent upon the right to a clean and satisfactory environment, which will definitely promote their development. And Article 21 of the same charter also sets out that all peoples shall freely dispose of their natural resources. So these are quite a few examples where you can see the regional international documents. Regional documents on human rights also speaks about the interrelationship between human rights and environment. So till now we were discussing how the international documents on human rights has addressed the aspect of environment protection. Now we are going to discuss the international instruments on environment, how they have addressed the issue of human rights protection. So I told you these are two different concepts, but they are everywhere intermingled and intertwined. So let's see the international environment documents in which human rights has been given significance. First and the most important being Stockholm Declaration, and it is proclaimed that man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being, and he bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. So again, this particular document, the Stockholm Declaration, it stresses on the need to protect human environment, which is very, very important to sustain life on the earth. And it is considered to be man's fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life. And that for that protection and improvement of environment is required, and that too it should not be limited only to the present generation, but it also should look into the future generations as well. The next important document which you can see is the B.A.L.B Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste and Their Disposal, 1989. This convention you might have learned in detail while you discuss the transboundary pollution. And this convention, its main objective is to ensure reduced transboundary movements of hazardous and other waste consistent with their environmentally sound and efficient management. And this should be conducted in a manner which will protect human health and environment against the adverse effects which may result from such movements. So the the what is the word, the transportation of transboundary hazardous waste should be done in a manner which will protect human health. It should not impair the human health, and also it should not adversely affect the environment. So this is what the Basel Convention has to speak about the human rights aspect. Now, the next important document is the Rio Declaration on Human Environment and Development. That is one among the major documents uh, which came as a result of the Rio Conference or the Earth Summit of 1992. And principle one of this particular declaration, it sets out that human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development, and they are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. And principle 4 establishes, in order to achieve sustainable development, environmental protection shall constitute an integral part of the development process and cannot be considered in isolation from it. So, with these two principles, we can understand that the significance of environment protection has been highlighted in order to achieve sustainable development. And attainment of sustainable development is one of the major goals in order to uh, achieve the standard of living. So, thus, these documents and these principles can be linked with, the human rights perspectives. The next important document on the international environmental law is the Johannesburg Declaration, that is the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which took place in the year 2002. And the plan of implementation of this particular document, it says that respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms are essential for achieving sustainable development. Now you can see a clear link between attainment or achieving sustainable development and also the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And the plan stresses the importance of action at the national level for successful development. So, in order to achieve this particular objective, that is sustainable development, the national level actions are very important. And the key components of the plan include good governance, the rule of law, gender equality, and an overall commitment to a just and democratic society. And transparency, accountability, and fair administrative and judicial institutions are considered essential for sound national policies to be carried out. In other words, we can clearly say that these are all important background, which is important when we talk about the human rights. And it also emphasizes the importance of promoting public participation in environmental decision making, including measures that provide access to information regarding legislation, regulations, activities, policies, and other programs. So, altogether, World Summit on Sustainable Development, that is Johannesburg Declaration, it clearly finds a relationship between human rights and fundamental freedoms, which is essential to achieve the sustainable development. Now, moving on, another important document is the first protocol to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. In Article 55, it relates to the protection of environment in times of war, and it states that care shall be taken in warfare to protect the natural environment against widespread, long-term, and severe damage. This protection includes a prohibition of use of methods or means of warfare which are intended or may be expected to cause such damage to the natural environment and thereby to prejudice the health or survival of the population. So, in this particular Protocol 1, which is attached to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, it has clearly stated the relationship between the necessity of protecting the environment during the time of war. And I hope all of you know Geneva Conventions. The four basic Geneva Conventions are considered to be the basics of the law relating to warfare or international humanitarian law. Then moving on, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on adverse effects of the illicit movement and dumping of toxic waste. This particular office was adopted with the increasing recognition that illicit traffic and dumping of toxic and dangerous products and waste pose a serious threat not only on the environment but also to the enjoyment of human rights. So a particular office was established by the United Nations with the specific or the reason behind such a special rapporteur was the knowledge that there is an increasing illicit traffic and dumping of toxic and dangerous products and waste, which not only poses problems to the environment but also it is affecting the human rights. That is why UN has appointed a special rapporteur on this particular subject. Next is the topic which we have already discussed many a times in the class, that is human right to environment under the Constitution of India. And we have again and again mentioned the 42nd Amendment Act and the insertion of Article 48, capital A, and 51A, and the expansion of Article 21 in order to accord protection to the life and personal liberty of every person. And we have also seen that through judicial interpretations, horizons of Article 21 has have expanded so as to include a wide variety of rights which are essential for an individual to live a life with human dignity. And this includes the right to a wholesome and clean environment, which includes the right to clean air and water as well. And I hope you remember all the cases which we discussed under Article 21, which I'm not repeating it here. So all those cases are relevant when we discuss human right to environment under the Constitution. And judicial activism since 1980s resulted in acknowledging that air, water and soil cannot be permitted to be misused and polluted so as to reduce the quality of life of others. So in order to achieve that dignified life, which is part and parcel of Article 21, we need to have a clean and healthy environment, unpolluted water and air, soil, etc. So this has been recognized by the various judgments which came after 1980s and which expanded the scope and ambit of Article 21. So while discussing this topic, human rights and environment, we saw that there is a correlation between the existence of environment degradation and its negative impact on the enjoyment of human rights. And this has been noted by the international community since 1970s, firstly with the commencement of Stockholm Conference. And climate change, deforestation, desertification, marine pollution, ozone layer depletion, loss of biodiversity, etc., are considered to be indicators of the environmental crisis faced by the humanity. Despite all international measures adopted to protect and improve the environment, the fact remains that problem of environmental pollution and degradation still remains a great cause of concern worldwide, and the unabated deterioration of environmental quality most vividly reflects the failure of these measures. Though we have various international environmental instruments, environmental law instruments, or conventions, documents, etc., which directly talks about the achievement of human rights or attainment of human rights, as well as we have international documents of human rights which specifies that right to clean and healthy environment is a precondition for the enjoyment of human rights. But even then we can see a lot of deterioration which is happening with regard to the quality of the environment. And though we have so many measures adopted in both human rights perspective and the perspective of environmental protection, the success has not achieved in that terms. Why human rights approach environment is important. So, a human rights approach will certainly help to secure higher yardsticks for environment. And the most prominent benefits of a human rights approach is that it helps the international community address and see the environmental issues from the perspective of most vulnerable, most neglected, and marginalized populations of the society. So, whenever we talk about human rights, this is one major aspect we need to remember, that human rights takes into consideration of everyone alike. So the vulnerable groups, the marginalized groups, everyone's interests are being protected under the international instruments pertaining to the protection of human rights. So if you look at environmental uh, or environment protection from that perspective, definitely it takes care of all the vulnerable and the neglected groups as well. Contrary to the ill-developed implementation bodies and the international environmental law, human rights is characterized by more sophisticated and developed implementation mechanics, and elevation of the right to a clean environment to a guaranteed human right will definitely increase the efficacy of enforcement. So when you compare international human rights law with international environmental law, you can see international human rights law is well protected under the international framework. So if the right to clean environment is made as a fundamental human right, then the enforcement of the same will be much better. So that's all with regard to the relationship between human rights and environment. So with that, we are completing our fourth module. So we have two more topics which is left towards the end of the fifth module. One is with regard to environment impact assessment, and the second one is with regard to the suggestions for sustainable living. So those two topics I'll cover in the next presentation. If you have any doubts, please do write to me or you can send me a message. Thank you.